On January 17, 2025, U.S. District Judge Nicholas Garofis sentenced the former finance minister of Mozambique to 8 years and 6 months in prison in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Manuel Chang, 69, had been convicted the previous August by a jury on 2 counts: conspiracy to commit wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. What Chang did to earn it was sign his name. According to the case prosecutors brought in the Eastern District of New York, 3 state-backed Mozambican companies borrowed roughly $2 billion, and Chang signed the government guarantees that made those loans sellable to investors. Prosecutors established at trial that he was paid $7 million for approving them, $7 million against $2 billion. The 3 borrowers were Privinvest, EMATUM, and MAM. Their stated missions were maritime security along Mozambique's coastline and a tuna fishing fleet, patrol boats, trawlers, radar, the physical business of guarding and harvesting a stretch of the Indian Ocean. 3 companies, 3 loans, 1 guarantor standing behind all of it. And the boats are the least interesting part of this story. The useful question sits upstream of them. Why did sophisticated international lenders put roughly $2 billion into 3 state-backed companies with no operating history in the record? The answer is the guarantee. A sovereign guarantee is a plain instrument. The borrower is a company. The guarantor is the government. If the company can't pay, the state pays. Attach one to a loan and the lender stops pricing the risk of a fishing venture and starts pricing the credit of a country. Those are 2 entirely different questions. One of them requires you to know whether trawlers catch enough tuna to service a 9-figure debt. The other requires you to know whether a sovereign government honors its obligations. The guarantee trades the hard question for the easy one. That's completely ordinary. It happens in legitimate development finance constantly. And the whole mechanism rests on one assumption: the official signing on behalf of the state is doing it for the state. At the arranging end of a loan this size, there's a project with hulls and radar and a business plan. Then the loan gets sliced up and sold on to other institutions. What the buyer holds is a piece of paper, an interest payment, and a guarantor's name. An institution holding a slice is pricing a credit, and the credit printed on that page belongs to a government. The further the paper travels from the shipyard, the more the shipyard stops mattering. On the other side of these deals sat Privinvest, an Emirati-Lebanese shipbuilding group. The $7 million came from there. What matters for the record is what a jury did with that fact. Chang was not convicted of bribery under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The government charged it as wire fraud and money laundering conspiracies. The wires that moved the deal and the accounts that moved the money. That's a narrower finding than the headline version of this story, and the narrower version is the one in the judgment. What broke this open was disclosure. Roughly $1.4 billion of the Privinvest and MAM borrowing had never been disclosed to the International Monetary Fund. Once that surfaced, the fund suspended its program with Mozambique in April 2016, and other donors froze budget support. The defaults came after. MAM missed a loan payment in May 2016. That November, in a press release dated the 21st, the fund's executive board formally found that Mozambique had misreported under its policy support instrument. In January 2017, Mozambique announced it would default on the EMATUM-linked Eurobond, missing a $60 million interest payment, and the guarantees Chang had signed pointed the bill back at the Mozambican state. Keep the economic damage that followed separate from the courtroom, because no court has adjudicated it as harm caused by any defendant in this case. What the courts did adjudicate starts with the bank that arranged the tuna loan. That bank was Credit Suisse. On October 19, 2021, the Justice Department announced a coordinated global resolution of the case. The admitted conduct was narrow and specific, defrauding investors in an $850 million loan for the tuna fishing project. Hold those 2 numbers next to each other because they are not the same number. The borrowing across the 3 companies came to roughly $2 billion. What the bank admitted to covers $850 million of that. 1 loan, 1 project. Credit Suisse Securities Europe Limited, the bank's UK securities arm, pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The parent company, Credit Suisse Group AG, did not plead guilty to anything. It entered a deferred prosecution agreement. In plain terms, the government files a charge and then agrees to hold it in suspension for a fixed term while the company meets a set of conditions. Run out the term without breaching them and the charge gets dismissed. There is no conviction on the record at the end of it. Breach them and prosecutors can revive the case on a charge that has already been filed. So the securities subsidiary walks away with a criminal conviction and the parent walks away on probationary terms with a charge sitting over its head. One entity carries a criminal conviction. The other, if it runs out the term, carries nothing, same bank on the letterhead. The headline figure on that announcement was $547 million. The Justice Department release sets out the three largest components, roughly $175 million going to the department itself, $100 million to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and $200 million to Britain's Financial Conduct Authority. Those components don't add to the headline number because the release lists them as principal pieces of the resolution, not the whole of it. The FCA published its own final notice the same day. Its fine came to just over £147 million, a shade above $200 million, and the regulator took one more thing. Credit Suisse gave an undertaking to forgive $200 million of Mozambican debt. A British financial regulator, as a condition of settling, made a Swiss bank cancel $200 million an African government owed it. Three former bankers from that Credit Suisse securities unit pleaded guilty in the same Eastern District case. Andrew Pierce pleaded to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Surjan Singh and Detalina Subhava each pleaded to conspiracy to commit money laundering. Added up. An entity guilty plea, a deferred prosecution agreement for the parent, three convicted bankers, a $547 million resolution, and a former finance minister sentenced to 8.5 years. From a distance, that looks like a clean sweep for the government. It wasn't. Jean Baustini was the Privinvest salesman at the center of the transactions and the government's central private sector target. In 2019, prosecutors took him to trial in Brooklyn. This was the case the government had built against the private side of these deals, tried in the same district that would later convict Manuel Chang. In December 2019, the jury acquitted Baustini on every count, not a partial verdict, not a hung jury on some counts and a conviction on others, every count. 5 years later, that same district convicted the former finance minister who signed the guarantees, so the record here holds two verdicts pointing in opposite directions. Whatever you conclude about how these transactions were assembled, a Brooklyn jury heard the government's case against its lead private sector defendant and rejected all of it. Back to that Brooklyn courtroom in January 2025. By the time Chang stood for sentencing, he had already spent approximately 6 years in custody, awaiting extradition and then trial. Garoffi's recommended credit for that time. On the arithmetic as it stood that day, 8 years and 6 months against roughly 6 already served pointed to about 2.5 more years before deportation. That projection is not how it played out. On February 12, 2026, Judge Garoffi's denied a defense motion for early release, finding no extraordinary and compelling reasons to cut the sentence short. In the same ruling, he confirmed a date, March 26, 2026, once sentence credit and good conduct time were applied. That was the end of his prison term, and it was not the end of his detention. He went from the Bureau of Prisons straight into immigration custody for removal. He did not walk free that day. The removal then took one more turn. Bloomberg reported that he was stopped at Boston Logan the following day over a Portuguese transit document problem for a Lisbon stopover. Reporting by the Portuguese news agency Lusa has him then held at the Plymouth County Correctional Facility in Massachusetts for about a week. He was removed on April 3, 2026, and arrived in Maputo on April 5, more than 7 years after his arrest in South Africa in December 2018. More than 7 years in custody, and the instrument at the center of all of it is still in use, still legal, still entirely routine. A finance minister's pen, turning a company's debt into a country's debt in a single stroke. Every safeguard built around that pen assumes the person holding it is working for the country whose name is on the paper. Cases like this one leave a docket behind, and I read them so you can watch the collapse in sequence. Subscribe for the next one.